Welcome to the deep dive. We're tackling something really interesting today, a voice message you sent in from Morpheus Thinks.
Ah, yes, that one.
It's a fascinating piece of audio. Throws a lot of perspectives our way.
Yeah.
Covering everything from the current geopolitical climate and economic worries.
To the
Uh,
influence of media and even some pretty big swings at future possibilities.
exactly. And your goal, as the listener, is to get a clear understanding of the core ideas here without getting, bogged down. And that's exactly what we're aiming to do.
Absolutely. What struck me immediately about this audio is just the sheer range of interconnected issues the speaker touches on.
Right?
We're looking at anxieties about global stability, finances, criticisms of the political landscape touching on both left and right, actually, observations about how information shapes our views, and then, yeah, some really ambitious ideas about the future. It's quite a ride.
It really is. And right up front, it's probably important to remember that Morpheus Thinks expresses some strong opinions and references different political viewpoints. Our aim here isn't to agree or disagree with any of it,
No, not at all.
but really just to understand the thinking behind these statements and pull out the key arguments. You're looking for knowledge, right? Not an echo chamber. So we're going to engage with this material head on.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's dive in. What's the speaker's overall take on the world right now? Where do they start?
Well, the audio kicks off with a pretty direct assessment. The speaker feels that things don't look good.
Okay. Broadly speaking.
Yeah, on both the geopolitical and economic fronts, there's this sense of concern, but also a hope expressed that common sense will ultimately prevail. It definitely sets a tone of unease right from the start.
Right. And pretty quickly, the speaker lays out a kind of central argument, which is that the left is currently, in their view, the main problem.
That comes through strongly.
Now, to really get this, you need to know the speaker mentions having identified with both left and right political positions in the past.
Yeah, that's important context.
What?
They even refer to themselves as a Thatcher child, which points to Margaret Thatcher's, significant impact on the UK economy.
That is a crucial piece of context. It tells us this isn't necessarily a lifelong, fixed political stance, maybe.
Exactly. And they acknowledge that Thatcher's legacy, well, it's viewed in both positive and negative ways, economically speaking, for the UK.
Yeah.
We also hear about their past involvement with both Republican and Democrat parties in the US. So that suggests a history of looking at different political perspectives, not just sticking to one side.
Exactly. And to give us more background on where these views might be coming from, the speaker shares a bit of their professional journey.
Which is quite varied.
Yeah. Starting in acting, then moving into investment banking, including working for the Queen's broker, apparently.
Right. And then later becoming involved in the early days of the internet, companies like Montgomery Securities, Macromedia.
That kind of diverse experience across different sectors, different eras, it likely shapes their current analysis of events, wouldn't you think?
Oh, almost certainly. It adds a lot of texture to their perspective. Someone who's had that kind of exposure is probably likely to see connections and patterns that others might miss. Their involvement with the early internet is particularly interesting when we think about their later points on media and technology.
Which brings us neatly to the speaker's thoughts on different generations. They seem to believe that Gen X is the last generation that possesses common sense.
But even they, according to the speaker, have been poisoned
Poisoned by what?
by what's described as an insidious, poisonous chalice. That's a pretty dramatic phrase.
It is very vivid. How do they explain that?
Well, they elaborate on this using a really strong analogy. Drug use, specifically crack cocaine.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, to illustrate what they perceive as an inability for some people to see reality clearly because of media influence. This visceral comparison really emphasizes their belief that media consumption is like fundamentally distorting people's understanding of the world.
And they directly tie this to the idea of manufacturing consent in media.
Yeah.
That concept often associated with Noam Chomsky.
Exactly. The idea that media can shape public opinion, make people accept certain ideas. The speaker then gives examples of what they consider to be left-leaning media outlets like the BBC, CNN, MSNBC, The Guardian, LBC, Bloomberg, and contrasts those with right-leaning media, mainly mentioning Fox.
What's particularly interesting there is the inclusion of Bloomberg.
Right. The speaker contends that even financial news networks like Bloomberg can be left-leaning and, susceptible to influence.
Influence regarding what? Market manipulation.
Yeah, particularly when it comes to market manipulation linked to geopolitical events. This points to a really deep-seated skepticism about the impartiality of mainstream media in general.
That skepticism, interestingly, then leads them to find a potential source of unbiased information. Artificial intelligence.
Yeah, they express a real excitement about AI. As a technology that could offer a more objective perspective, this idea of AI as a neutral observer, it comes up again later.
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? The idea that an AI, free from human biases, could give us a clearer picture of complex situations.
It's certainly compelling, and it speaks to a broader desire for trustworthy information in what many people perceive as a heavily biased information environment these days.
Okay, then the audio takes a slightly different turn. The speaker recalls a prediction they made in the past about the Arctic region.
And following that, they raise the possibility of a future conflict between Europe and the United States.
Really? Based on what?
They reference a documentary from the 1990s. So this feels more speculative, kind of drawing on past observations to predict future scenarios.
It does highlight the speaker's tendency to look for historical parallels, maybe, and to extrapolate potential future conflicts based on past trends and how media portrays things.
Yeah, the specific mention of a 90s documentary suggests they've been thinking about these kinds of geopolitical shifts for quite some time.
Following this, the speaker sort of doubles down on their opinion that left-leaning media has essentially brainwashed multiple generations.
Right, from baby boomers all the way to Gen Z, it really underscores their central critique of media's impact.
Building on this, they introduce the concept of hypernormalization. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. So hypernormalization, basically, it describes a situation where everyone kind of knows things aren't working or aren't true, but they collectively pretend that everything is fine. The speaker suggests that this process is at play in shaping our perceived reality.
Leading people to believe in a certain version of events, even if it doesn't quite line up with their own experiences or, well, facts.
Exactly. And all of this leads to a very strong critique of wokeness,
Right.
which the speaker believes has, and this is a direct quote, destroyed the minds of millions.
That's a very strong statement.
It is. This is clearly a significant concern for them, and it seems to be a key lens through which they interpret current social and political developments.
And it's important, I think, to acknowledge that wokeness itself is a term with varied, often contested meanings.
Absolutely. But here, it represents the speaker's perception of certain contemporary social and political ideologies as being detrimental. Regardless of how one defines it, it's clear the speaker views it as a powerful and negative force.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the economic landscape they describe. Where do they start?
They begin by addressing the massive U.S. national debt, pegging it at $36 trillion.
$36 trillion, wow.
And they state quite plainly that the piper has to be paid. It's a sentiment that probably resonates with a lot of people worried about long-term fiscal health.
No doubt. The sheer scale of that debt is a huge economic reality.
And a topic of considerable debate, obviously, among economists and policymakers. The speaker's direct phrasing really underscores the feeling that this debt will eventually have to be addressed somehow.
And then they turn their attention to Europe.
Yeah, describing a shifting power dynamic with the rise of what they consider socialist economies. They also touch on the UK's current economic struggles and reiterate their view that Margaret Thatcher was the last truly effective prime minister the UK had.
Okay, so that reflects a particular economic philosophy favoring Thatcher's free market policies.
It seems so. The speaker appears to view current socialist-leaning economies in Europe as being overly reliant on debt. They use this analogy of constantly using credit cards to illustrate what they believe is an unsustainable economic model.
They also weave in a historical perspective, don't they?
Yeah.
Referencing the history of wars in Europe.
They do. And from this, they suggest a possibility of Europe becoming involved in another conflict, potentially with Russia.
Under what they perceive as maybe a false pretext.
That seems to be the implication. This is a rather concerning prediction, hinting at historical patterns of conflict potentially repeating themselves.
And they seem skeptical of the current narrative around Russia being the main adversary.
Yeah, mentioning that Russia's earlier interest in joining NATO after the Cold War was apparently not welcomed.
Which leads into this critique of the military complex.
Right. The interconnected network of military defense contractors, related industries, they see it as a major global industry that actually profits from conflict.
And they contrast this with the idea of humanity achieving a Type 1 civilization.
Yeah.
That relates to the Fermi paradox filter, right?
Exactly. The Fermi paradox, for anyone unfamiliar, is basically the question, where is everybody? Why haven't we found evidence of alien civilizations given the size of the universe?
Hmm.
The speaker seems to be suggesting that our continued focus on military development and conflict is a kind of self-imposed barrier, a filter that stops us reaching a more advanced cooperative state.
That's a really interesting connection. Framing a reliance on this massive military infrastructure as a potential obstacle to our progress as a species.
Yeah, suggesting our resources and ingenuity are being funneled towards conflict instead of, say, solving challenges like energy independence or interstellar travel things that might let us reach Type 1 status.
The speaker then expresses a kind of general disappointment, a lack of cleverness in humanity.
Mm-hmm. Citing selfishness, aggression, lack of cooperation as major factors holding us back, it reinforces that somewhat pessimistic outlook they've shown.
This more fundamental view of human nature seems to underpin a lot of their concerns, doesn't it?
It really does. They seem to see these inherent tendencies contributing to the geopolitical and economic problems they've outlined.
And this then leads to a prediction about conscription.
Potentially, yeah. Conscription and maybe reduced freedom of movement in Europe due to this risk of conflict they foresee.
But they also issue a call for Europe to do something different.
Yes, to prioritize peace and invest in innovation instead of just continuing to focus on military spending.
That's a clear articulation of their preferred future. Move away from military buildup towards peaceful development, technological advancement.
But they also suggest it's hard to break away. The crack cocaine analogy reappears here
Oh,
to emphasize how difficult it might be for nations to break away from the entrenched military-industrial complex.
and they point out the huge global market value of that complex.
Yeah, underscoring the sheer economic scale of this industry.
Yeah.
It highlights the magnitude of the challenge in shifting away from a global economy so heavily invested in military spending. The financial incentives are just enormous.
Now, the audio pivots to something really different and kind of radical.
Mm-hmm.
This proposal for a startup government in the U.S.
Yes. This is pretty unconventional.
Can you walk us through the core idea?
Absolutely. So the speaker proposes that the U.S. government should divest a significant portion, they say specifically 50% of its military budget.
Half. Wow. And do what with it?
Redirect those funds into a dedicated government startup division. The goal here would be to invest in a really diverse range of startups.
Like tech startups.
Both tech-focused ventures and more traditional small businesses, like mom-and-pop businesses. The aim being to revitalize local economies, high streets, create new jobs.
And it's not just about giving money away, right?
Yeah.
There's an equity component.
Exactly. The speaker suggests the government, in exchange for this investment, would take a minority equity stake, maybe around 10% in the startups it funds.
Okay, so the government potentially gets a return if these businesses succeed.
Precisely. It's envisioned as a way for the government to potentially see a return on investment, further fueling economic growth. It's a much more active, you could say more entrepreneurial role for the government compared to just, grants or subsidies.
And the speaker draws connection to President Trump.
Yeah, suggesting that his background in business might make him more receptive to such an idea, given what they describe as the transactional nature of his approach to governance.
The thinking being that someone with a business background might see the potential upside.
That seems to be it, the potential for tangible returns. The speaker also makes the point that advanced military hardware is basically a sunk cost if it isn't actually used.
Which further supports the idea of reallocating those resources.
They use another analogy here, too, comparing this proposed shift away from heavy military spending to Margaret Thatcher's controversial dismantling of the UK coal industry.
Framing both as addressing an anachronism, something outdated.
Exactly. This reinforces the idea that, in the speaker's view, a dominant military complex is becoming an outdated model in our rapidly evolving tech-driven world.
Just as Thatcher argued, the coal industry wasn't economically viable anymore.
The speaker seems to believe that excessive military spending is hindering future progress.
And they link this back to social issues, too. The state of high streets, youth well-being.
Yes, they point to the declining state of high streets in both the U.S., mentioning San Francisco, L.A., and the U.K., London, and express concern about younger generations maybe experiencing less social interaction, lower overall well-being.
So the startup government idea is presented as a potential way to fix that, too, by injecting vibrancy and economic activity back into local communities.
That seems to be the connection. Fostering local businesses, creating opportunities, could lead to improved social connections, a greater sense of well-being, especially for younger people.
Okay, let's move on to the speaker's analysis of Trump's economic and foreign policy specifically. What's their take there?
Well, they seem to believe that Trump genuinely desires to minimize military conflict,
Oh, really?
but is facing significant resistance from that powerful military complex we just discussed.
So a more nuanced interpretation of his motivations, perhaps? Acknowledging a tension between maybe a stated desire for peace and those entrenched interests.
That seems to be the view presented, yeah. They mention his approach to peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, for example,
Hmm.
and his administration's shift in the U.S. stance on NATO, emphasizing a prioritization of America's own
Which
interests.
aligns with the whole America First foreign policy doctrine.
Exactly, a more transactional view of alliances, more focus on domestic priorities.
The speaker then revisits the debt issue, that $36 trillion national debt inherited by his administration.
Mhm. And notes the recent market corrections at the time of the recording. Dow, S&P 500, NASDAQ all entering recessionary territory. They even suggest a further deeper correction in the Dow could be possible, down to 28,750, I think they said.
Okay, so tying current market conditions back into those initial economic concerns.
Definitely. Clearly seeing these downturns as significant indicators of underlying economic vulnerabilities.
Interestingly, though, they view recessions as normal, a natural part of the cycle.
They do. And from this, they pivot back to a criticism of what they call the woke side of politics,
How does that connect?
arguing that it lacks a fundamental understanding of entrepreneurialism and the crucial role that entrepreneurs play in driving the global economy.
So, linking back to their earlier critique of wokeness,
Mm.
suggesting a perceived disconnect between that political viewpoint and the principles of business and economic growth.
Pretty much. They really emphasize the importance of individuals who create wealth and generate jobs.
They also express concern about wealthy individuals, millionaires, leaving the UK.
Yeah, due to the current economic and political climate there. Then they highlight the significance of the Treasury bond yield,
Ah, the T-bond yield.
key indicator.
Right. Mentioning the 5% level as a critical threshold for inflation, and even referencing much higher potential yields predicted by economists like Simon Hunt or in past JP Morgan analyses for the UK.
And just to clarify for listeners, the Treasury bond yield is essentially the return on U.S. government debt, a benchmark for interest rates. A big rise can signal inflation worries, lead to higher borrowing costs across the board.
Exactly. The speaker is focusing on these key macroeconomic indicators as potential warning signs. Substantially higher T-bond yields could indeed have significant ramifications.
They then point to ongoing inflationary pressures, especially in housing, hitting younger generations hardest.
And argue for the necessity of a significant correction in the economy. A correction which they believe Trump was attempting to achieve through his policies.
That seems to be the framing. Presenting Trump's economic policies as a necessary, maybe painful measure to address these inflationary imbalances and the difficulties young people face affording assets like housing.
They then go on to explain the use of tariffs, not just as protectionism.
No, they describe tariffs as a hedge strategy and a negotiation tactic in international trade.
Giving examples of companies like pharma firms, TSMC.
Right, making investments in U.S.-based manufacturing as a direct result of these policies, leading to job creation here.
So arguing tariffs were tools designed to incentivize domestic investment and strengthen U.S. manufacturing.
That's the argument presented, which
Yeah.
leads to a direct disagreement with Professor Scott Galloway's view that manufacturing should largely stay overseas.
Dismissing that view as a wokeness lefty thing.
Yep. The speaker strongly advocates for the critical importance of domestic manufacturing, especially in the context of the Fourth Industrial Revolution.
Right, the fourth industrial revolution, that fusion of physical, digital, biological tech, AI, robotics, advanced materials.
And the speaker emphasizes the data-centric nature of this modern economy, using Tesla as an example where manufacturing and data are deeply intertwined.
So it's not just about making things, it's about the data generated while making things.
Precisely. They see domestic manufacturing, especially in these advanced sectors, as crucial not just for economic growth, but also for data security, maintaining a competitive edge.
Hence the skepticism about relying too much on overseas production, particularly China. Concerns about data control, the social credit system.
Exactly. They even suggest Africa as a potential alternative location for manufacturing
Interesting.
and highlight the possibility of advanced manufacturing playing a role in revitalizing struggling urban areas within the U.S. and other developed nations, bringing manufacturing back.
Offering a broader vision for global manufacturing's future, more diversified locations, tech bringing jobs back to deindustrialized areas.
That seems to be the hope. The speaker concludes this section by saying they believe Elon Musk understands this vital importance of U.S.-based manufacturing.
Especially for AI and quantum computing development.
Right. Reinforcing the idea that leading tech figures recognize the strategic imperative of having a strong domestic manufacturing base in these cutting-edge fields.
Okay, finally, let's delve into the impact of artificial intelligence. This was a significant concern raised in the audio.
It was. The speaker actually recommends listeners check out a conversation between Tom Bellew and Mo Gaudat on blockchaincompany.info for a deeper dive on AI's future.
But what's the speaker's own outlook? You mentioned it seemed dark.
They do characterize it that way, yeah. But they clarify the primary source of concern isn't really the AI technology itself.
Oh, what is it then?
It's human nature. Specifically, our inherent adversarial tendencies, the ongoing competition between major global powers, US, China, Europe. That's the worry.
Okay, so the danger isn't the tool, it's how we might wield it against each other.
That seems to be the core concern. They point to rapid advancements in, for example, video AI, and predict this will lead to significant disruption within the advertising industry.
Makes sense. AI generating high-quality video quickly and cheaply could definitely shake things up there.
No doubt. The audio also references projections from various big organizations, Oxford University, the World Economic Forum, McKinsey, Goldman Sachs.
About job losses.
Yeah, potential job losses due to AI's increasing capabilities. The projections range from millions to potentially hundreds of millions of jobs being impacted globally.
Those are staggering figures, highlighting the potential for massive transformation of the labor market.
Absolutely. And there's also just considerable uncertainty about the extent to which new jobs will be created to offset these losses and what those new roles might even look like.
The speaker then introduces the concept of M2M transactions, machine to machine.
Right. Suggesting that in the future, we'll see more and more economic activity happening directly between devices without human intervention.
And what does that mean for human work?
Well, they propose the future of human work will increasingly focus on knowledge trading through specialized platforms, with human intellectual capabilities becoming the most valuable commodity.
Knowledge trading, like selling our expertise.
Kind of. They even mention their own platform, 4IR GPT, as a potential facilitator for this. It paints this futuristic picture where automation handles routine tasks, and the primary value humans provide is our specialized knowledge.
The idea of human neurons becoming a valuable commodity. That's a striking image.
It really is. Emphasizes the importance of our intellectual capacity in this evolving landscape.
They also touch on the possibility of humans doing more creative things and maybe living off UBI.
Yeah, universal basic income or similar models, acknowledging the potential societal shifts needed if AI does lead to significant job displacement. UBI often comes up in those discussions.
And they use Elon Musk's layoffs at Twitter as an example.
Right, where around 85% of the workforce was reportedly cut, as an example of technology's potential impact on workforce size, emphasizing the efficiency possible with lean, AI-leveraged companies.
And they also express confidence in their own crypto token, 4IR.
Yeah, suggesting they see digital currencies playing a role in this future, perhaps within their proposed 4IR ecosystem.
Well, that was definitely a deep dive. We covered a huge amount of ground there. Geopolitics, economics, AI's transformative potential.
Yeah, it's clear Morpheus presents a very interconnected, often critical view of the current global landscape.
While also offering some pretty unconventional ideas for navigating the future, like that startup government concept.
Absolutely. The audio provides a really wide-ranging, thought-provoking perspective, raises significant concerns about current trends, but also proposes some bold, innovative solutions. It definitely gives us a lot to consider about the challenges and opportunities ahead.
So for you, our listener, reflecting on all these interconnected ideas, the speaker's underlying concerns about human nature, especially facing powerful technological change. Here's a final thought for you to chew on. Given these perspectives on geopolitical instability, economic challenges, the rapid rise of AI, what do you see as the most critical shifts? Shifts in mindset, shifts in actions that individuals and societies need to embrace to navigate the complexities of the future successfully?
That's a big question. Certainly a lot to ponder.
It is indeed. We really encourage you to keep thinking about these issues, maybe explore the ideas that resonated with you further.
And develop your own informed opinions on these really complex topics.
And that brings us to the end of this particular deep dive. We'll be back soon to explore more of the fascinating information and perspectives you share with us.
Looking forward to it.
Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep thinking critically.